don't think it is within human nature for people to treat a civilization-threatening risk in the workplace with the appropriate respect over decades and decades of their working life. It's just not something you can do. Eventually, you go to work and it's just another day, and you can't, I don't think you could live with that kind of awareness, and yet we're asking people to do. We've been asking them to do it for years and years. I think, next one would be priorities other than safety. We see this an awful lot. I think it's been mentioned earlier today. The main imperative in this country, and this comes right from the top, is that we will possess nuclear weapons and we will be ready to fire them at a moment's notice. And safety, if it's considered, is way down the line. I think the example I gave you earlier of the weapons ending up in the Falklands War, of all places, is a great example of that. Their priority was to send some ships to fight the Argentinians, not to spend time removing nuclear weapons. Windscale is another example. Again, they wanted to produce the plutonium by a particular time, and safety was not the main concern. And we'll see another example later, incidentally, of this. Then there are just accidents that happen, road accidents, as Nigel was saying in the video. There's, was one tragic occasion where somebody, this wasn't the fault of the convoy driver, but a nuclear convoy vehicle was struck by somebody who crashed their car into them and spilled petrol all over the place. It could easily have become ignited. That could have been a very, very serious incident. These things do happen. Another example, this is not from the UK, but in the film Command and Control, which is based on an extremely good book by Eric Schlosser. That film deals with one particular incident where a gentleman who was refueling a ICBM in the United States dropped a spanner, and this caused a change of circumstance which meant that the ICBM exploded in its silo and fired a nuclear warhead up into the air and around the countryside in Arkansas, I think. Accidents do happen, and we live with this risk, all of us do, all the time. There are also things you can call acts of God. Somebody mentioned lightning strikes earlier. There's 2 lightning strikes, one on a convoy vehicle, one on an aircraft loaded with nuclear weapons that are listed in our report. And then degradation. Machines get old and they stop working, things stop working, and that's the subject I'm going to talk about for the rest of this presentation. So in our report, there aren't very many examples of warhead degradation, of the warheads themselves getting old and stopping working, and I just want to spend a moment or two talking about why that might be the case. Firstly, it might be that simply people are less willing to disclose incidents where this has happened. Maybe they're much more secret about that, and they're happy to talk about the time their convoy vehicle crashed, but not so much that when a nuclear warhead nearly exploded. Or perhaps degradation meant there have been security issues, but they weren't ever incidents as such. It was just things were less safe, but nothing really happened. So it's not really cropped up. It's not there in the historical record for us to track down and have put in the report. There's possibly an issue, this is much more of a modern thing, but modern warheads are designed to fail safely. If stuff stops working, the warhead should not explode as opposed to explode. That wasn't always how they were designed. As I mentioned, the Greengrass warhead, which was a horribly unsafe object. Supposedly, modern nuclear weapon designs are safer than that, and they should fail safely. So maybe that's one reason. Another is the amount of money we spend on upgrading them. So the budget for the atomic weapons establishment is around about £1 billion a year. And they have a permanent upgrade program there. It's not that they do one-off upgrades. They have permanent research facility there, and they permanently are looking at upgrading nuclear weapon designs. And they are also, as we heard earlier, they are permanently replacing the tritium in the warheads because it doesn't last as long as the other elements in there. At present, what's happening in AWE is that they are upgrading the UK stock of warheads to what's called the Mark IVA warhead. Because of the very valuable data collected by Nukewatch, we can be fairly sure that HMS Vengeance in 2016 was loaded with these Mark IVA upgraded warheads, and we expect that in the intervening time, other submarines have probably been fitted with them as well, or will be in the near future. The Mark IVA upgrade is, I suppose you could call it a minor upgrade. It doesn't involve a fundamental change to the design of the warhead. It's swapping around the components. The government, if it was forced to talk about this, they'd much prefer not to at all, but if it was forced to, would very much want to portray this as a minor program done out of necessity for safety reasons. But it's actually a bit more complicated than this. So it's a replacement of, amongst other things, electronic components, including the arming and fusing system. And the thing about this is it allows them to be much more certain about the accuracy of their targeting. So if they have a list of targets and they're trying to target particularly underground bunkers or silos, if you can be more certain about the accuracy of your targeting, you maybe won't send 3 nuclear warheads after one target, maybe only send 2. So it's actually, subtly, it's actually quite a significant increase in capability. And you might say, well, the UK doesn't have very many warheads, maybe it's not a big issue, but the US is doing a similar thing as well. And so there are actually quite significant implications for strategic stability internationally from the Mark IVA warhead upgrade program. Similarly, there's also a huge diplomatic cost to the UK that we continue to upgrade our warheads, in that we've promised to get rid of them, our nuclear weapons, and we keep not doing it. And one of the major driving factors behind the other countries of the world getting together
launching the nuclear weapons ban is that they could see that the nuclear weapon states are continually upgrading their nuclear weapons. So it's a big issue. We will also, in this Parliament, we will see the government take a decision on whether to undergo, take a decision. I think in this Parliament, the government is going to announce that they have decided to do a major upgrade to the warhead, which would be a much more significant redesign. We're told the decision will be taken in the next Parliament. I think it's safe to say that that's a foregone conclusion with our current government, but yeah, you should expect the decision to be announced by 2022. So, one of the reasons that I feel very confident in saying that the decision is a foregone conclusion is that the way that the atomic weapons establishment works particularly is that for the government to keep possessing nuclear weapons in this country, they have to maintain the capacity to build them and to maintain them. To maintain the capacity to build and maintain them, they need a workforce. They need the industrial plant, they need the skills and the knowledge to keep doing that, and they have to give these people something to do. And that's why they have what I call sort of upgrades in perpetuity. They will continually upgrade, and they will continually maintain, and they'll continually improve their nuclear weapons for as long as they have them, because if they stopped doing that, they would lose the capacity to keep having them. I think it's a really important issue to bear in mind, and I've called this sort of institutional degradation. They need to do this to avoid their institutions degrading, to avoid the loss of knowledge to be able to keep doing this. So that's warheads. I've talked quite a lot about warheads. And the reasons why you don't see very much, or we haven't seen many incidents of warheads degrading and accidents as a result. On missiles, there's not loads and loads of incidents that we know, but the missiles aren't used very often. They're just carted around, basically. There was, as probably everyone here knows, in the news last year, it was revealed that one of the UK's rare test firings of a Trident missile went wrong in 2016. It's probable, I think, that this was due to degradation. The Trident missiles are currently undergoing what's called a life extension program. So this is analogous to the Mark IVA upgrade in that it's a replacement particularly of the electronic components rather than a fundamental redesign of the missile. And I suspect, but I don't have any hard evidence of this, that what went wrong in that test firing were components that are currently being replaced in the life extension program. So life extended Trident missiles are now deployed on some US Trident submarines. I think it's likely that some of the UK submarines have been fitted with them as well. They will certainly all be fitted in due course. It's just a question of when. If you recall, there was quite a lot of press interest in a visit by HMS Vigilant to the US last September. The press interest was mostly around what the sailors did when they were there, yeah, they got up to no good, basically. But I think it's likely that they were going to the US to be fitted with upgraded life-extended Trident missiles at that time. During the lifetime of the Dreadnought submarines, the new successor submarines to Trident, it is likely that we will see a more fundamental upgrade to the Trident missiles. This will obviously be led by the US, and the UK will tag along, as is it went. Again, this is something where officially no decision has been taken, but it's very likely to happen. Obviously, the dimensions of a missile will not be able to change very much. The missile tubes will stay the same size, but they will just redesign the internals of the missiles. So that's the warheads, that's the missiles. Where you can much more clearly see degradation is in other elements in the program that maybe don't get quite as much attention or quite as regular upgrades. So in the convoys, in the support vehicles of the convoys, there was a flurry, an uptick, if you will, of the incidents that occurred in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, around the time that vehicles that were called Mammoth Majors, you remember that name was used in the video we've seen, when they were getting towards the end of their life, there was a lot of problems with them. There was a similar pattern sort of between 2010 and 2015, where the high security vehicles that transported nuclear materials, but not the warheads, as I understand it, as they were getting to the end of their life. And these kind of things that you would see, you'd see failures of clutches, of brakes. In most cases, this just meant that the convoy stopped in the middle of the road where it was supposed, where it was supposed to be travelling. And obviously, there's quite serious security implications from the convoy travelling at all. But for it to be static in one place, that's a much greater security concern. There was in the 1960s, we know, an incident where a handbrake failed on a truck carrying nuclear warheads, and it ran into the front of a terraced house. There was no detonation, there was nothing like that, but that's the kind of thing that could conceivably happen. I say conceivably happen. This is the kind of thing that has happened because part of a truck broke. Also on the submarines, I think there's real indication of degradation. You may recall a gentleman called William McNeely, who was a whistleblower who had been a submariner, and he gave a very alarming picture of the Vanguard submarines and the poor state of repair in them. If we go back to the Polaris submarines, towards the end of their in-service life in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, they had some very serious issues with the reactor pipework. And these were so serious that it said that sometimes the submarines would go on patrol, and all they'd do is they'd go and rest at the bottom of the sea somewhere rather than travel around anywhere, because they wanted to run them as little as possible because they weren't safe. A decision was taken, despite them being unsafe, that they would remain in service. Again, this is an example of what we were mentioning before of priorities other than safety. They had to keep running the submarines because, God forbid, we should not have nuclear weapons pointed at somebody at any given moment in time. But this was against the safety advice of their regulators. Coming back to the Vanguard submarines, the reactor in the Vanguard submarines is a successor design to the Polaris reactors. And we've seen similar problems in the Vanguard submarines beginning to emerge, I think. We heard earlier about the test reactor in Dounreay. So this was a submarine reactor that was built a few years before the first Vanguard submarine went into service. And it was run in a test establishment. And in 2012, they realised that there was a leakage of radioactivity into the coolant water. There had been a breach of the fuel. This is a similar issue, maybe slightly different, but a similar issue to what occurred on Polaris, in my understanding. And as a result of this, that 2 years later, after sitting on the information for 2 years, the MOD announced that they were going to have to refuel HMS Vanguard. This was an unplanned refueling and at a cost of £270 million. And they suggested it might also be necessary to refuel HMS Victorious. These are the 2 oldest Vanguard submarines. That's the reason for these 2. HMS Vanguard is in Devonport at the moment. If you want to go on Google Maps and get the satellite view, you can see it in the dock, covered in tarpaulin. They've taken the reactor out of there. They've also decommissioned the test reactor that was in Dounreay. They've taken it apart. So they've looked at the 2 oldest Vanguard reactors. Officially, no decision has been taken on whether it's necessary to refuel HMS Victorious as well. But I think a very interesting, significant thing happened last autumn, which is the MOD has its own internal safety regulator for some elements of its program. So this regulator has responsibility for the warheads once they are assembled, and the warheads once they're in transit. So it's responsible for the convoys, and it's also responsible for nuclear safety on board the submarines, including the reactors. And it supposedly follows the same regulatory constraints as the Office for Nuclear Regulation, but it's really just a department of the Ministry of Defence, and it answers to the Ministry of Defence. However, until quite recently, the MOD would release rather brief but informative reports from their internal regulator. Last autumn, they announced that they were not releasing the nuclear safety reports for 2015-16 and 2016-17, and they have said that it would compromise national security for them to release these reports. Our friend Rob Edwards, who can be here today, I believe wrote stories on this. And I think the timing is quite interesting. So the report in 2015-16, the first of these 2, was the year where they decommissioned the reactor in Dounreay. So it's quite possible that during that year, they learned a lot more about what was actually going on inside their submarine reactors, and they didn't like it. It's not the only possibility. One of the issues continually highlighted in these reports when they were releasing them was the issue of staffing, that just simply they don't have enough staff, or they have very few staff who are qualified and able to guarantee safety in the defence nuclear programme. So it's possible that the decision to not release these reports is due just to them having ongoing staffing issues or some other thing that I've not. I do think the timing is quite suspicious. So it is possible that they have discovered some real serious issues in the submarine reactors, and maybe history is repeating itself. Maybe they are again running submarines in the knowledge that they're not safe, but it's necessary for us to have nuclear weapons pointed at someone at all times. So that's what's happening. And it's important to say, I don't know what the safety implications of these issues might be. The construction of the submarine reactors is classified, and so it's not really possible for someone in my position, for us in this room, to know what the safety implications might be. If a civilian nuclear power reactor had these issues, they would shut it down and they'd mend it, they wouldn't run it. But who knows what they're doing with the submarines. I suppose one indication of the kind of thing that might happen would be an incident called the Celtic Deep incident, which occurred when HMS Vanguard went into an uncontrolled dive following the loss of power. So they, I think, were on an exercise, and possibly they shut down their reactor as part of the exercise, and the backup power failed. And there are safe operating limits for the submarines. They can't go as deep as they like. They have to stay above a certain depth. Otherwise, the pressure puts the submarine at risk. And it would appear that the submarine went into an uncontrolled dive, and there was a risk of it essentially getting squashed and the submarine being lost. It didn't occur on this occasion, but a problem with the reactor might be the kind of thing that could cause this to happen. It's not known exactly what happened, but there was an incident with a US submarine called the USS Thresher, I think in the 1960s, where a submarine was lost, and it's believed that failure of power caused that submarine to be lost. So that was somewhat speculative, but I hope that gives you some sort of an idea of the kind of thing that might happen as machines get old. The Vanguard submarines are getting towards the end of their life, and they are in the process of building replacements. I think it's almost certain that the program to build the replacements will go massively over budget and massively go behind timetable. I think I'd happily lay money on it if I could find someone who'd take the bet, because I'd be rich. So in conclusion, machines degrade, institutions degrade as well. To keep institutions running, you need a perpetual upgrade program. They have that at AWE. They don't have that in all the other parts of the nuclear weapons program. And I think we sometimes see the consequences of that in accidents that occur. And there's a real contradiction between the political determination that this country should possess nuclear weapons and the willingness to actually pay the full price of maintaining safety, of keeping all of the equipment in good working order, of paying all of your staff, mostly to sit around and be ready for the few times they're needed. There's not really a political willingness to be straight with the country about what this costs and what is required. You're most likely to see problems arising lower down the chain of the warheads themselves. As I say, the warhead program does have a perpetual upgrade element to it, but other parts don't. And the greatest risk is towards the end of service life of the different elements. My final conclusion is that accidents will happen. They do, and they will. And having nuclear weapons means we're living on borrowed time. Let's stop.
Those of you who are in other organisations may want to sign up to the nuclear. I have had a number of people who have apologised for having to leave early. It wasn't because they weren't interested, it's because there are still some doubts as to what's happening. I see the sunshine out here, what's happening to transport in the east of the country. Now we'll hear a contribution from Carol, who's going to place things in a political context, and then we'll take some questions and discussion. Carol.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invite to speak here this afternoon. I'll start maybe by saying a little bit about myself. I am currently the Member of Parliament for Glasgow North West. I represent the SNP, but my background is in education. I was a physics teacher for 20 years, and during this time I was incredibly political without really wanting to be in politics. And as part of that, I got involved in a whole pile of different things, causes, campaigns, and one of these was CND and anti-Trident marches. So it was quite interesting then when I met my husband. Some of you will know that my husband is Fergal Dalton, and at the time I met him, he was a weapons engineer officer based at Faslane in the Trident submarines. So that was interesting. Fergal wasn't able to take part in the marches that I would go on, but he often dropped me off, and in that way he felt he was contributing to the cause. So that's a little bit about me. I'll start by saying something about submariners working on Trident submarines, because submariners often say, if we ever have to launch we have failed to deter. Because nuclear weapons are not actually designed to be fired. And they will say that they are being used now to keep the peace. Now, this is the underlying principle, of course. But let's be clear, there's no moral justification for nuclear weapons. Now, if we look at them, they're an indiscriminate weapon. They're a weapon that will cause absolute devastation. And if we are using that as a method of deterrence, we should also be looking at other things. Why don't we have biological weapons as a deterrent? Why don't we have chemical weapons as a deterrent? And we don't have these because it is morally wrong. Yet somehow we're happy to put nuclear weapons into a different category. So they're not there as a deterrent. They're there to fill the strategic aims of the UK government. They are there to keep the UK government at the big boys' table at the UN. And they're there to basically ensure boys can continue to play with their toys. I have real issues with this, and people talk about, well, how do we stop it? How do we extricate ourselves from this situation? Surely we have to wait for other people to disarm. And to me, that's like a smoker saying, I know it's not good, I know it's not the right thing to do, I'll wait till everybody else stops smoking and then I'll think about doing it. You know, we just need to make the decision that this is not right and we are going to do it. But we have got ourselves into a predicament of nuclear weapons, and we need to get ourselves out of it. Now, back in 2014, if you cast your minds back, in the referendum white paper, the Scottish Government said that it would support the rest of the UK remaining in the United Nations Security Council. However, there's now talk about other members being part of that. Members who don't have, or countries that don't have nuclear weapons. There's talk of Germany, Japan, Brazil, India, countries like that having a seat, a permanent seat. So we do not need, now more than ever, we do not need nuclear weapons to maintain our place. So we need to, as a global community, start to decouple country standings in the UN from their possession of nuclear weapons. And until that happens, there's going to be really slow progress in disarmament worldwide. So I would really like to see a wider representation in the UN Security Council, first of all. But ultimately, I've already said boys with toys, the crux of it is that Whitehall love their nuclear weapons. And that's a very difficult thing to get over, because if you're saying, actually there's not a moral justification in terms of our global standing, we're reaching a point where we don't need them to be at that table, why do we have them? So ultimately it comes down to this idea of we want them because they're flashy, they're exciting, they're like having a sports car, they show offy, all of these things. These are not toys, however. It's not boys with toys. It's an incredibly dangerous weapon system that has no moral justification. Recently, we have seen defence budget being cut and cut and cut, and yet Trident budget is protected at all costs. So we've seen a massive depletion of conventional defence throughout the UK. As an island nation, or a group of nations in these islands, we should be very concerned about that. We're losing amphibious capabilities. The Marines have been cut back. We're losing Albion and Bulwark. We have no warships based in Scotland. Now, we know now that we have Russian incursions. We know now that with the Arctic ice melting, there are new shipping routes through. What we should have in terms of our defence of a small island nation, and whether the UK likes it or not, we are a small island nation, we should have defence that's concentrated, that's looking up north and not down south. So why are all our major warships currently in Plymouth and Portsmouth? We also have to look at defensive conventional forces like the Army and look at what they are currently having to deal with. Very poor housing, poor equipment, been sent to war zones without proper protection. These are all issues, but we still have Trident protected. Now, it's interesting because in Parliament we've had a number of defence debates over the last few months about the defence budgets. And across the House, there's real cross-party support for increasing the defence budget. But there's no cross-party support for getting rid of Trident. So what they want to do is keep that, but increase everything else. And there's also a lot of talk about taking Trident out of the defence budget altogether, move it into a different budget so that you can protect that defence budget. But that's not happening either. But what there is no talk about is getting rid of Trident. So we've reached a point here where I've already said it's morally unjustifiable, but it's also economically and financially unsustainable. If we want proper defence for an island nation, we need to be looking at something else. At the moment, all our eggs are in one basket. And let's be perfectly clear here. If Russia did decide to increase its aggression, we do know there have been incursions into UK waters. If Russia did decide to increase its level of aggression, what do we have to defend ourselves here? And I would say we're faced with two choices. We can either nuke them, and I think we can guess who would come out worse in that situation, or we can chase them off with a pitchfork, because we've left ourselves very little else. I would say, as a maritime nation, we're now in an embarrassing situation of having no maritime defence. Excuse me. I'm going to move on now to talk about this idea that was raised multiple times during the independence referendum and since. And one of the favourite things that's thrown at us from particular politicians is that Trident is some elaborate job creation scheme. Now, I can tell you that when my husband finally retired from the Navy, he was inundated with offers of work from defence companies, from non-defence companies, from engineering positions, from all sorts of things, all offering him significantly more money than he was paid as a lieutenant commander in the Royal Navy. So therefore, if we're talking about people on these submarines who usually have a third-level qualification in engineering, if we're talking about them needing Trident in order to stay in a job, we are frankly being patronising and untrue about their capabilities. Now, we know that also to keep people in the submarine service, we have to offer very generous retention bonuses. And even with this, they're struggling to keep enough suitably qualified personnel there. So this is not a job creation scheme. And we do the people working in Trident a great disservice to talk about them in that particular way. Excuse me. The other thing that I should say is that if we get to a stage where nuclear weapons are being decommissioned, many of these people that are currently working in Trident would be required to do that job, because these are the most highly qualified people. These are the people that understand the system. So they would be required for a long time into the future. And I am a member of the SNP, I'm pro-independence. But I think, realistically, we need to consider that if Scotland is to gain its independence, that the Trident submarines will be there, or their successors will be there for a bit of time beyond that, whilst this decommissioning. Yes.
Independent government in Scotland need to do absolutely nothing with the Trident. They need birth. If it's birth, it's tied up. If it's tied up, it can't be deployed. It can't be deployed at itself. An independent government just simply leaves it there and then negotiates, remove a filing pin, then remove from the base court. It's actually very simple. So I'm sorry, Carl.
Okay, you can disagree with me. You can disagree with me, Brian. That's okay, and I don't mind that. But I do think there's got to be realisation. We can't just leave them sitting there. There are nuclear reactors in them. There are nuclear warheads in them. We don't want them sitting there. We want them out. But there has to be a process to get them out. So that process is not going to happen overnight. And certainly when Ireland gained its independence, some naval bases were kept during a transitional phase. And I think realistically that has to be considered. But talking about Faslane again, Faslane is of incredible strategic importance. It is a massive naval base. It doesn't need submarines in it. It is a naval base that's closest to the high north, and those shipping routes and potential threats. It's the closest base we have to these particular situations. So we need to start thinking about how we will use that base, because there is going to be plenty of work there. It's also a deep water base, which is really important too. So I can see in the future, without Trident, that Faslane will be a busy military port and will employ just as many people as are employed at the moment, but without the need for the Trident submarines being there. Now, if I go back to my start where I said I am a physics teacher by profession, and one of the quotes I really love is by a physicist called Albert Einstein. Not Albert Einstein said, you cannot simultaneously prevent and prepare for war. So, are we at the moment trying to prevent war, or are we trying to prepare for war? And I think at the moment with Trident, we're confused about what that actually is. If your fundamental underlying strategy is to prepare for nuclear war, you're going to end up going into one. Of course, that's debatable. But if we're going to have security against biological, atomic, chemical weapons, we have to think about how we're going to prepare for these. And we don't prepare for this by having these weapons ourselves. We prepare for this by having intelligence. We prepare for this by having conventional forces. We prepare for this by having a strategy other than sending out a continuous at-sea deterrent. A UK without Scotland has no place to keep its nuclear weapons. And certainly, if we use the argument of they are there to keep us at the big boys' table, a UK without Scotland will struggle to maintain that role. And that's a strategic reason that the UK is clinging on both to Faslane, to Trident, and to Scotland. And that's the same strategic reason that the main parties at Westminster, the government and the main opposition, have no interest and no plans ever to get rid of nuclear weapons. So I believe the only credible way of getting rid of nuclear weapons from Scotland is through independence. I mean, we can talk about how we don't like Trident, we can talk about our dislike for nuclear weapons, but it will not happen. We won't get rid of them until Scotland can say, you no longer have this, you no longer have Faslane, you no longer have the place to keep your weapons. That is the route to getting rid of them for Scotland. Ultimately, Whitehall isn't that interested in what Scotland thinks. So I do think there is a role here, and we have to consider the future of Scotland as an independent country. But we also within that have to think about where the threats are coming from. We know there are threats and opportunities presented by the High North. We know that cyber is a massive threat to us just now. And we know that Russia is flexing its military power. So we need to consider Trident in this framework and think, first of all, morally, are we going to support it? Morally, personally, I can't. Financially, economically, can we support it? The UK can't afford to do it because if it does, it can't deal with the threats that are being presented just now by these other things. It doesn't have the money to do it. So ultimately, Trident has to go if we are to properly defend ourselves. Now, I'll finish by saying small island nations do not need nuclear weapons to play their part globally. Today is St. Patrick's Day, and Ireland's an example of a small island nation. There are others. We can look at Denmark, not quite an island, but quite close to it. There are other small island nations that have conventional, sensible and reasonable defences to deal with with their position and their situation. So on St. Patrick's Day, I would say, happy St. Patrick's Day. I hope you managed some Guinness. I believe, I was just checking my phone before I spoke, I believe Ireland have just won the rugby or are about to win the rugby at Twickenham, which means that both my teams have won today. I would leave you with the thought, the only route I can see, because of this sheer love for Trident, sheer love for nuclear that is practiced and is encouraged in Whitehall, the only route to get rid of nuclear I can see is through an independent Scotland.
Well, thank you, Carol, and I'm sure there are quite a lot of points. Sorry. Be anxious. Thanks. Sorry. One point. Okay now. Just one point I'll throw in, David, that I just noticed in something recently. It refers to what you were saying about this pressure to keep on modernising because you need to keep the nuclear workforce together, was in relation to the new Hinckley Point C nuclear power station, which almost everybody who knows anything about it regards as excessively risky and expensive. And it was a couple of academics, I think from Sussex, giving evidence to a Commons committee who said, but one of the principal reasons the government has gone ahead with this very expensive development is that if it does a core of nuclear expert workers in the power station section, it will have to pay for them under the defence budget, and this would push up the costs very markedly there. So there is that interrelationship that isn't always apparent. Questions, comments? Oh, sorry. Thanks.
I mentioned this morning that I believe the UN decision of 122 countries to put a ban down on nuclear weapons was a game changer. What was quite revealing about the explanations given by a number of countries was that while the US, Britain and France delivered a separate joint statement, and Germany and Holland made their own individual statements, what was revealing was that all other NATO countries attached themselves not just to a joint statement along with a number of other countries. I say all NATO countries because the critical important thing here is that while you may or may not believe that an independent Scotland can bring about a change in relation to nuclear weapons, surely the current SNP position runs against your fundamental proposition that you can both prepare for and prevent war. So surely the continuation of membership of a clear US-run military alliance, that is NATO, runs against your position altogether.
Hi, this is a question for Carol. I've forgotten, now that I'll come to ask the question, I've forgotten the name of this actual committee at Westminster, but it's where massive projects go to have their feasibility tested. That's the one. And I was reading not long ago that the Trident replacement system has never come near getting through that process. So I'm a wee bit confused as to, that being the case, how they are getting away with pushing full steam ahead for their plans for fast lane when actually they can't get it past their own committee set up specifically to look at the feasibility of these big projects.
Sorry, just my interruption was not intended as a criticism. It was actually to agree with you. I totally agree with you. There is no feasible way other than independence. But what I am saying is that the day independence is declared, Trident is kaput. Legally, defence is our concern of an independent Scotland. The British government can have no say in it. So from the day of the midnight, the day of the declaration of independence, Trident cannot operate legally, and it cannot operate anywhere else in the UK. As John Ainsley proved in his book, Trident, nowhere to go. That's why independence is the only immediate way I see of getting rid of Trident. So I'm actually agreeing with you. I apologise for a rather rude interruption. Sorry.
Okay, if I maybe deal with them back to front, I don't know if this is on, in terms of when Scotland becomes an independent country, let's say that's in 5 years' time, for argument's sake, there will be the day of the vote, there will be the day of independence, and there will be a transitional period that will go between those two and beyond those as well. And I think that's a reality for many systems and many things. The detangling cannot take place instantly, and we can see this through the Brexit process, although probably I think part of the problem with the detangling in Brexit is actually the incompetence with how it's been handled. But there will be the decoupling will take a bit of time, and unfortunately, Brian, I think I will need to disagree with you on this, because I think there will need to be an agreement that there will be a transitional process. If there is nowhere else for these to go, we do not want them sitting there indefinitely. We do want them dismantled, we do want them taken apart, and then we want them out of there. But if there's nowhere for them to go, there's got to be a time period during which that takes place. In terms of the Public Accounts Committee, I think it between the Trident replacement and other nuclear-powered submarines that have been built, I think they've said that the cost has risen by £1 billion. Now, risen by, that's not its entire cost, and they are talking about the feasibility of it, but the money will be found. Believe me, they will take it from pensions, they'll take it from disabled, they will take it from anywhere they can in order for this to be done. Committees, any committees of Westminster are set up to advise government. Their recommendations do not need to be followed, which is frustrating, of course, because usually there's expert witnesses that have given evidence and the report is drawn up as a result of that. But unfortunately, the recommendations that are made from a committee are recommendations only. So although they can say that the cost of this is astronomical, although they can say there's no money for it, ultimately money will be found. We'll feel the pain of it, or certainly people in our community will feel the pain of it, but the money will be found. And unfortunately, at the moment, I would say conventional defence is feeling the pain of it, and that's something we should all be very concerned about. In terms of NATO membership, well, you'll know there was a massive debate within the SNP about this very issue, and actually I wouldn't say it divided the party, but it certainly caused a lot of heated debate, shall we say, within the party because of this very issue. And it is an issue that probably still brings on a large amount of debate, but ultimately a vote was taken and a position was taken, and I understand what you're saying, and there are many people that would agree with your position. However, within a party, if there is a vote taken, if there is a debate and a position is taken, then we have to respect that position. And I don't always agree with everything that is decided, but that's the nature of being in a member of a party, that has been decided democratically by the members, and that has to be respected. So, yes, I understand your point, yes, I understand your frustration, but we are where we are, and maybe in the future that is an issue that will be debated further or debated again.
David, have you any you'd like to add?
I have something to say about NATO membership, actually, which is, as an English person, I don't have a strong opinion on the SNP's position about this. But as a point of fact, we released a report looking at the UK and the ban treaty, and as part of that, I looked at the compatibility of NATO membership with membership of the ban treaty, and the conclusion I came to was that there are no hard institutional barriers to membership of the ban treaty and opposition to nuclear weapons and NATO membership. It's a question of political pressure. It's a question of how uncomfortable a country that decided to take those positions and retain membership of NATO would be. I think one of the very interesting political developments that we'll see, or what I hope we will see with the nuclear ban treaty is whether non-nuclear NATO member states will decide to join. There are several that are under quite a lot of domestic pressure. The Netherlands was obliged to attend the ban treaty negotiations, much against the wishes of the government, because their parliament voted and required them to go and attend. Similarly, in Norway, I think that's another country where it's possible that domestic political campaigning will cause them to join the ban treaty. So yeah, I'm just throwing that into the mix, really. I think it's maybe not quite as clear-cut. I hope that's helpful.
Okay. Just a reminder that SCND, the late John Ainsley, did produce a detailed report in 2014 called Disarming Trident, which is still available for people, which went through the technical stages of the process. And it is all around the issue which comes into the ban treaty too. They have a very specific set of procedures for countries which have other countries' nuclear weapons on their territory. And the key is very early, you have to make them non-operational, which means removing the warheads. But that is in the ban treaty. We do have a report on that. So if you're interested in that, there's quite a lot of here. Someone here?
Carol, I think this is possibly putting you on a little bit of a spot, so forgive me for doing so, yeah. But it's a question surrounding really the position taken by the party in relation to the level of identification with the risky escalation and presumptions lying behind Theresa May's reaction to what happened in Salisbury. Put this in context of two things that Russia has said recently. One of these is its claims of being able to make a first strike that you can do nothing about. Two, its nuance of you do not mess with the nuclear state. The fear, if, and this is absolutely hypothetical, there was to be an escalation in the way that the Westminster government reacted to whatever Russia does next, where to start a preemptive cycle of escalation. The obvious target, potentially, of a demonstration that Russia has this potential probably is Coolport or Fast Lane. And I think this puts the SNP in a very difficult position in the Westminster Parliament as to how closely it identifies with Theresa May's decisions, whatever they're going to be, and how we position ourselves as a nation in relation to our long and in a way very much more positive relationship with the people of Russia, between those of Scotland and Russia. And it's just what your thoughts might be on this. It's not asking for a definitive policy, it's just to explore these potential scenarios because they have such obvious immediacy at the present time, and I think we need to think very carefully how we position ourselves in what we're saying publicly.
I think number two, and then unless there's anything desperately pressing, we'll wind up and let you a little end.
Thank you. I know we're near the end of the day, but I just want to confirm something. I know that quite a few speakers have spoke about it today. Just a few miles up the road, we've got Faz Lane, we've got Coolport. Now, at Faz Lane, it's Royal Naval submarines. I believe there's 4 Trident submarines that are based at, as well as a few others, at Faz Lane. So it's Royal Naval boats with Royal Naval personnel. The warheads, as we've discussed, are created or built at Aldermaston. But the actual missiles themselves come from the United States of America.
Can somebody just confirm for ourselves and also for the live stream audience who actually owns the actual American missiles? Is it the American government? Is it independent companies? Who actually owns them?
Is there any other point? One final point. Jane?
It's more of a comment, really, I think, than a question. Just to say that whilst I think we're all agreed that getting rid of Trident is a big priority and that will make us all much safer, and whether we turn the key on them or whether we work out how to dismantle them or whatever we do, to not have them and not let the UK have them will make us safer. But it's just that some of us actually have some hopes for something better for Fastlane and better for those resources, that money, those people, than to have a big bristling conventional base at Fastlane. We'd like to put that money into perhaps some other things.
But I think who owns the missiles, and then I think perhaps the others are...
I'll have a stab at it. The UK, as I understand it, owns the right to have a certain number of missiles at any given time. I guess it's a bit like a timeshare, something like that. You know, there's a common pool, and we can have some of them for a given period of time, but the missiles themselves get swapped over, but we can't maintain them. We can fire them, we can't maintain them. Lockheed Martin have to maintain them, and yeah, I mean, I think to some extent the idea of whether it's the US or the UK who owns them is a bit of a red herring. I think Lockheed Martin own them. That's the bottom line. They're calling the shots. They're in charge here.
And who programs the targeting?
Yeah.
Thanks. Totally agree with that. Who programs the targeting? That's done by MOD and British government. So that's that one. If I make some comments about the Russian situation, this is extremely unusual for me, and it's probably the first and probably last time I will say this, but I'm totally in agreement with Theresa May over this one. I think Russia has been flexing its muscles for a long time. This is not the first incident. This will not be the last incident. We need to be aware the threats from Russia are not just nerve agent attacks. They're cyber attacks that are happening many, many times every day. They are coming from Russia. They are Russian state organised. The cyber attacks are not the only thing. There are military attacks that are happening. They're not all being reported, but these are happening. So we need to be very aware. I know the campaign in social media just now has been saying we shouldn't be too hasty. We need to watch what's happening and everything else. I think we would be naive to think that Russia are just are a friendly alliance at the moment. They are flexing their muscles, and we need to be aware of that. In terms of Russian people here in our community contributing, absolutely, they're welcome. They should be here, they should be contributing, and we should be building relationships with them. But we have to be doing that in an atmosphere of understanding that there are threats coming from the Russian state just now that are directed towards the UK and UK's allies. So I think we need to be extremely careful. And I know many of you in this room won't agree with me on that, but I do think we need to be cautious on this one. And this is, I mean, if we set this in the context of today's programme, it's even more important that we are concentrating defence resources on things like conventional ships and cyber. And if we're not doing that, we are not defending ourselves properly. The other thing is the Fastlane. Ultimately, an independent Scotland needs defence, the same way as a homeowner needs a lock on their house. we need a defence, but I think defence could be considered in a different way. I think defence in an independent Scotland is about defending, but it's not about projecting global power and projecting a position. I don't see us going into war zones in the way that is happening just now, but we have to realistically consider shipping routes, consider where threats are going to come from. In independent Scotland, it would be irresponsible for us to say in an independent Scotland we won't need defence. We will need defence. I don't see our defence being similar. I see it being completely different to what we have just now, and we will need bases like Faslane. We just don't need Trident submarines in it.
But is that not exactly what you were saying earlier about prevention or repair? You're still talking about preparing.
I'm not talking about preparing for nuclear war, though.
I think we're maybe a wee bit late in a long day, and perhaps that suggests there are other occasions in which we maybe have to have this wider debate. But I think we could go on for another hour or two if we get right into this. So I really have to, I think, end our day because we have covered a huge amount of ground. And you've been so good. I mean, all of the audience, although some had to leave earlier, have been so good at sitting through what was a very interesting, very educational program. And now some thick thanks. David Torjustas, Ian Fairley, David Cullen, and Carol. So thanks to and David Newbigging. David, you've done so much work preparation, but today, so much thanks, and I do hope you get funding for that, to complete that film, because it really does look very interesting and the kind of thing that audiences, wider audiences, will watch and be drawn into. And Indie Live is such a big difference to the political and campaigning scene in Scotland, when so many people who can't access what's going on can still participate, watch things. So a big thanks to Kevin and Indie Live. All the work done by Helensburgh CND and Vaseline Peace Camp for this, and particularly to Ellen, who's done a huge amount of work. Staff at the Wee Terrace for catering. I have been asked also to thank Julia Dennison, who's the church hall coordinator, who's been very helpful, and those who ran the stalls today. But I'd also like to thank the National and Common Space news site, because there were two, I think probably about the only two, that sent me two publications which helped to publicise the meeting, not just publicise the meeting, but helped to explain what it was all about. So it's been very important for us. And the Helensburgh Advertiser and the Dumbarton Advertiser. Those are probably more important in the context of this. And thanks very much to the audience. And I hope wherever you're going, this includes me, because where I came from this morning, the snow was starting. But thanks very much for coming today.